Imagine this. It is December 1776 and the American Revolution is dying. Not struggling. Not merely losing momentum. Dying. New York is gone. The British have taken the city that Washington tried so desperately to defend. The Continental Army has been pushed from Long Island, driven from Manhattan, forced through New Jersey, and chased across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania like a wounded animal trying to survive one more night. The men are exhausted, their clothes are torn, their shoes are falling apart, some march with rags wrapped around their feet, others leave bloody marks in the snow and frozen mud. Food is short, money is almost worthless, disease moves quietly through the camps. The weather is turning vicious. And every day more soldiers ask themselves the same question. Why are we still here? The Declaration of Independence had been signed only months earlier. On paper, America had declared itself a new nation. But on the ground, that nation barely existed. It had no real capital safe from danger, no professional army strong enough to face Britain in open battle, no navy that could challenge the Royal Navy, no reliable money, no permanent supply system, no guarantee that the states would sacrifice enough to keep the war alive. It had George Washington. And even Washington was running out of army. That was the most terrifying part. In a few days, thousands of enlistments would expire. Men who had survived the disasters around New York would be legally free to go home. They had been beaten, hungry, cold, humiliated, and chased across state lines. Many had done their duty as they understood it. Their farms needed them. Their families needed them. Their bodies were finished. If they left, Washington might have no army left to command. And if there was no army, there was no revolution. No independence. No United States. No future country to remember this moment as a heroic origin story. Only a failed rebellion, crushed by the greatest empire on earth before it ever had the chance to become a nation. The British thought they could see the end. They had good reason to think that. They had beaten Washington again and again. They had taken New York. They had driven the rebels through New Jersey. Loyalists were becoming more confident. American morale was collapsing. The Continental Congress had fled Philadelphia. British commanders believed that one more season of pressure might finish the whole thing. And then, on Christmas night, Washington made a decision that sounded almost insane. He would take what was left of his freezing, shrinking, half-starved army. He would cross an ice-choked river in the middle of a winter storm. He would march through darkness. He would attack the Hessian garrison at Trenton before they could understand what was happening. And he would do it, not because he was winning. He would do it because he was almost out of time. This is the story of the night America refused to die. To understand why Trenton mattered, you have to forget the way 1776 is often remembered. Today, 1776 sounds like destiny. It sounds like parchment and signatures, bells and speeches, flags and fireworks. It sounds like the year America announced itself to the world. It sounds inevitable because we know how the story ends. But the men living through 1776 did not know the ending. To them, it did not feel like destiny. It felt like disaster. And that contrast is what makes this moment so important for an American audience. The year that became a symbol of national birth was also the year that nearly buried the revolution before it learned how to stand. The distance between the words in Philadelphia and the frozen roads of New Jersey was enormous. In Philadelphia, independence could sound clean. It could be argued in paragraphs, it could be printed, signed, read aloud, and turned into a moral claim. But on the roads outside New York, independence had to be carried by men who were hungry and underpaid, by officers who did not know whether their units would exist next month, and by a commander who understood that a nation declared on paper could still die from exhaustion. That is why December matters more than the famous summer scene. July gave America its voice. December tested whether that voice had a body behind it. A declaration can say that men are free. It cannot force a soldier to stay in the snow when his enlistment is almost over. It cannot make shoes appear. It cannot make money worth something. It cannot stop the British army from advancing. Only action could do that. And by late 1776, action was exactly what the American cause seemed least able to produce. The year began with hope, but by summer, the rebellion had entered a much darker phase. The British returned to America with overwhelming force. They did not come to negotiate, they came to restore imperial authority. They came with warships, regular troops, Hessian auxiliaries, experienced commanders, and the confidence of an empire that had no intention of losing its colonies to farmers, lawyers, merchants, and provincial soldiers. New York became the great test. Washington knew the city was important. It had one of the finest harbors in North America. It connected rivers, roads, and sea lanes. If Britain controlled New York, it could use the city as a base for the rest of the war. But Washington was trying to defend a place that was almost impossible for his army to hold against British naval power. The British could move by water. Washington had to guess where they would land. That was a losing game. At Long Island, British forces outmaneuvered the Americans and nearly destroyed them. Washington escaped disaster only by evacuating his troops across the East River under cover of darkness and crops. It was a brilliant escape, but an escape is not a victory. Then Manhattan became a trap. The British pushed again. American positions collapsed. Fort Washington fell in November, costing the Americans thousands of prisoners. Fort Lee had to be abandoned soon after. Supplies were lost, cannon were lost, tents, tools, equipment, and morale all disappeared on the roads of retreat. Washington withdrew through New Jersey. That phrase sounds neat in a history book. In reality, it was a slow-motion catastrophe. The army moved because it had to. Behind it came British and Hessian forces. Ahead of it were uncertain roads, frightened civilians, bad weather, and the constant fear that the army might simply dissolve. Washington could not stand and fight because losing one more major battle might end the war. So he retreated. Again, and again, and again. Every retreat saved the army for another day. Every retreat also made the revolution look weaker. The retreat also changed the politics of ordinary life in towns across New Jersey. People watched the armies move and made hard calculations. Some had supported the Patriot cause loudly when it seemed possible. Others had stayed quiet, waiting to see which side would prevail. Still others were loyal to the crown and now felt the wind moving in their favor. That is one of the uncomfortable truths of revolutions. Most people do not live inside slogans. They live inside danger. They have farms, shops, children, debts, neighbors, and memories of what happens when the wrong army enters town. If the British looked certain to win, then supporting Congress could become not only risky, but foolish. If Washington's army disappeared, what protection could the Patriot cause offer anyone? British and Hessian troops moving through New Jersey brought anger as well as fear, foraging, seizures, rough treatment, and the general violence of occupation hardened some civilians against them. But anger alone does not always become resistance. People still needed to believe resistance had a chance. That was the gap Washington had to fill. He was not merely moving troops on a map. He was fighting for the confidence of a population that could no longer be expected to support a cause that looked doomed. This is the terrible mathematics of survival. Washington preserved the possibility of victory by refusing to be destroyed. But each mile of retreat made people wonder whether the cause was already lost. Soldiers lost confidence. Civilians changed sides or stayed silent. Loyalists became bolder. British promises of pardon began to sound practical to people who only wanted their homes and families to serve. The revolution was not just losing battles. It was losing belief. And belief is the oxygen of a rebellion. A rebellion without belief becomes a crime waiting to be punished. A declaration without an army becomes a piece of paper. A congress without soldiers becomes a debate club running from city to city. A commander without men becomes a title with no power behind it. Washington understood that. He did not need a perfect victory. He needed proof. Proof that the army was not finished. Proof that the British could still be surprised. Proof that the cause was not dead. Proof that staying a little longer might still matter. That was the real purpose of Trenton. It was not just a military operation. It was an act of resurrection. And just before Washington made his gamble, another man gave the revolution words for its desperation. Thomas Paine, whose pamphlet Common Sense had helped push Americans toward independence earlier in the year, now wrote a new essay for a darker moment. The American crisis opened with a line that would become one of the most famous sentences of the war. These are the times that try men's souls. It was not decoration, it was diagnosis. Paine understood that the easy patriots were leaving. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot could cheer when the cause was new, but the winter soldier had to remain when defeat looked more practical than glory. Washington had Paine's words read to the army shortly before the crossing. That detail matters because it shows the battle was being fought in two places at once. One battle would happen in Trenton. The other was happening inside the minds of the men who had to decide whether the revolution still deserved another night of suffering. Paine gave them language. Washington gave them movement. Together, words and action created the possibility of revival. By December, Washington's army had crossed into Pennsylvania. The Delaware River now stood between him and the British forces in New Jersey. The British had spread their troops into winter quarters. They expected the campaign season to be over. In the 18th century, armies often slowed down during winter. Roads became miserable, weather became dangerous, supply problems multiplied, commanders became cautious. The British had every reason to believe Washington was finished for the season. Maybe finished for good. Across the river in Trenton sat a Hessian garrison. The Hessians were German troops hired by Britain. They were not cartoon villains, and they were not fools. They were trained soldiers. Many were disciplined, tough, and experienced. American propaganda loved to paint them as foreign mercenaries fighting for money, and that image helped fuel anger in the colonies. But on the battlefield, Hessian troops could be formidable. The garrison at Trenton was commanded by Colonel Johann Rall. Rall was brave and experienced, but his position had problems. His men were tired from weeks of alarms, raids, and hostile countryside. The local population was not always friendly. Intelligence was imperfect. The Americans had been beaten so badly that many British and Hessian officers not believe Washington could launch a serious offensive. That assumption was the opening Washington needed. Trenton was not the largest target. It was not the British main army. It was not the final battle of the war, but it was close enough to reach, isolated enough to attack, and important enough that victory there could echo far beyond the town itself. That is the genius of the choice. Washington did not attack where he wanted history to be glorious. He attacked where a desperate victory was still possible. That is what good commanders do when everything is collapsing. They do not ask for the perfect opportunity, they find the one opportunity still within reach. And Trenton was within reach, but only barely. The geography made the gamble even sharper. Washington's force was on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware. Trenton was across the river in New Jersey. Between them was not just water, but weather, darkness, ice, and uncertainty. The river protected Washington from immediate attack, but it also separated him from the only victory close enough to matter. He needed boats. He needed secrecy. He needed men who knew water. He needed artillery moved across a river that did not want to be crossed. He needed timing. And timing was the one thing the storm immediately began to steal from him. The plan called for several American forces to cross at different points. If everything worked, the Hessians at Trenton would be squeezed by coordinated attacks and denied an easy escape. But coordination in 18th century warfare was difficult even in good weather. On sea, Christmas night, it became almost impossible. The men moving Washington's main force included tough mariners and rivermen, among them soldiers from John Glover's Marblehead Regiment. Men with experience handling boats under miserable conditions. Their work was not glamorous, but without them the painting never exists, the army never crosses. And Trenton remains only an idea in Washington's head. This is another reason the story should not belong to Washington alone. Great decisions still need practical hands to make them real. The plan was bold, Washington would cross the Delaware River on Christmas night with the main force. Other American columns were supposed to cross elsewhere and support the attack, creating pressure from multiple directions. Once across, Washington's men would march about 9 miles to Trenton and strike before dawn. On paper, it was clean. In reality, almost everything went wrong. The weather turned brutal. Rain, sleet, snow, wind, and ice hammered the river. The Delaware was not a calm black ribbon waiting for heroes to glide across it. It was dangerous, swollen, and full of ice. Boats had to push through chunks of frozen water. Men had to load horses, cannon, ammunition, and soldiers in darkness while trying not to make enough noise to alert the enemy. The operation was delayed. The crossing took far longer than planned. The other American columns failed to cross or failed to reach their objectives. That meant Washington's main force would attack without the full coordination he had hoped for. The entire operation could have been cancelled. Many commanders would have cancelled it. The army was late, the weather was terrible, the men were exhausted. The supporting columns were not where they were supposed to be. Surprise could be lost. Failure could destroy D8. He last real army of the Revolution. But Washington kept going. This is the part that makes the story powerful. Not that everything worked perfectly, it did not. The power of the story is that Washington continued when perfection had already disappeared. The famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware makes the moment look clean, almost ceremonial. Washington stands upright in the boat, heroic, composed, surrounded by men rowing through cold water beneath a dramatic sky. The image is unforgettable. It has become one of the most famous visual symbols in American history. But the real crossing was worse. It was darker, colder, messier, more frightening. Men slipped, horses panicked, artillery had to be moved with agonizing care. Boats fought the current and the ice. Officers tried to keep order while time bled away into the storm. Soldiers who had marched, retreated, starved, and frozen now had to trust that this impossible night would not become their grave. Some of them must have wondered whether Washington had lost his mind. Think about what he was asking. He was asking men who had every reason to go home to cross a lethal river in the dark. He was asking them to march through a storm after midnight. He was asking them to attack Ned soldiers in a town across enemy-held territory. He was asking them to risk everything for a revolution that looked, to many observers, like it had already failed. And they went. Some of the men who went would later become part of larger American memory. James Monroe, a young officer who would one day become president, took part in the attack and was wounded at Trenton. Henry Knox, already proving himself as one of Washington's most valuable artillery officers, helped move the guns that would dominate the streets. John Glover's sailors and soldiers helped make the crossing possible. Nathaniel Greene and John Sullivan led columns through the storm. But most of the men were not future presidents or famous generals. They were the kind of people history usually compresses into a number: men in a column, men in a boat, men in the snow, men holding muskets under wet blankets and trying to keep dry. Men whose names may never appear in the story, but whose obedience and endurance made the story possible. That is the truth hidden behind every national myth. The leader becomes the symbol, but the unknown men carry the symbol through the mud. Washington could decide to cross. He could not personally row every boat, drag every cannon, calm every horse, steady every freezing soldier, and march every mile for every exhausted man. The army had to choose step by step to keep following. That choice is part of the victory. That is the emotional heart of the story. Washington is essential. But he did not cross the river alone. The operation depended on exhausted, ordinary men who could have been forgiven for believing the cause had asked enough of them. Men from errant states, men with frozen hands, men whose enlistments were nearly over, men who had seen defeat after defeat and still climbed into the boats. A nation was not saved by a painting. It was saved by cold men doing one more impossible thing. After the crossing, the army still had to march. The delay meant they would not reach Trenton before dawn as planned. The roads were miserable. The storm continued. Muskets were difficult to keep dry. Men struggled forward in darkness, moving through snow, sleet, and wind. The march itself became a test of endurance. Washington's force split into two main columns for the final approach. One column moved under General Nathaniel Greene, the other under General John Sullivan. Sullivan sent word that the storm had soaked his men's muskets. Washington's response was exactly the kind of line that belongs in this story. "Tell General Sullivan to use the bayonet. I am resolved to take Trenton." Whether every word has been polished by memory or not, the meaning captures the moment perfectly. There was no going back. This was not a motivational slogan, it was the operational truth. Once the army had crossed, hesitation became more dangerous than action. The river that had separated Washington from Trenton now threatened to separate him from safety. If the attack failed, retreat would not be simple. If the Hessians reacted quickly, or British forces nearby moved with speed, the American army could be trapped on the wrong side of the Delaware. That is what made Washington's resolve so important. A commander in such a moment cannot let every difficulty reopen the question of whether to continue. At some point, the decision has to harden. The men need to feel that the plan still has a center, even while the details are falling apart. Washington's message to press on, even with wet muskets, gave the operation that center. It told the army that the purpose of the night had not changed. The river had been crossed. The storm had been endured. Now Trenton had to be taken. Not now. Not after the river. Not after the march. Not with the army's future hanging by a thread. Washington did not need a clean victory. He needed Trenton. By the time the Americans approached, the Hessians were not expecting the blow that was about to fall. There is a popular myth that the Hessians were simply drunk from Christmas celebrations and therefore easy prey. That version is too simple. The truth is more interesting. The Hessian garrison had been under strain for days. They had received warnings before. They had dealt with repeated alarms and local harassment. They were tired. And the storm made a serious American attack seem unlikely. Rawle did not fortify the town as strongly as he might have. Patrols and readiness were not enough to prevent surprise. The Americans did not win because the enemy was stupid. They won because Washington attacked at the moment the enemy believed he could not. That is a much better lesson. The attack began on the morning of December the 26th. The Americans entered Trenton from more than one direction. Artillery played a crucial role. Henry Knox, the same man who had helped bring cannon from Fort Ticonderoga to the siege of Boston, now helped ensure American guns could dominate key streets. The cannon were placed where they could fire down the roads and disrupt any Hessian attempt to form an effective defense. The town erupted. Hessian soldiers rushed from quarters into confusion. Drums beat. Officers shouted. Men tried to form up while American troops pressed in. The weather, which had almost destroyed Washington's plan, now helped complete the surprise. The storm had hidden movement. The late arrival had not ruined the attack. It may even have added to the enemy's confusion. Rawle tried to rally his men. He was not cowardly. He did not simply run. He attempted to organize a counterattack, but the situation was already collapsing. American fire, artillery, surprise, and pressure from multiple directions made it difficult for the Hessians to recover. Rawle was wounded. Hessian resistance broke apart. Within a short time, the battle was over. Washington had won. The scale of the victory was almost perfectly suited to the crisis. It was large enough to shock the enemy and electrify American morale, but small enough that Washington could realistically achieve it with the force he had. Around 900 Hessian soldiers were captured. Rawle was mortally wounded. The garrison, that had seemed secure the night before, was suddenly gone as a fighting force. For Washington's army, the material results mattered. Prisoners mattered. Weapons mattered. Supplies mattered. But the emotional result mattered more. The same army that had been retreating for weeks, now marched into a town and forced trained enemy troops to surrender. That kind of image can change how men stand. A soldier who yesterday felt like a fugitive can today feel like part of an army again. A civilian who yesterday thought the rebellion was collapsing can today whisper that Washington Ton has struck back. A politician who yesterday feared the cause was lost can today argue that the commander still deserves support. This is how a small battle becomes a strategic event. It changes posture. Not only where armies stand, but how people stand inside themselves. Hundreds of Hessian soldiers were captured. American losses were remarkably light compared with what might have happened if the attack had failed. The victory was not enormous in usual military sense. It did not destroy the British Army. It did not end the war. It did not recapture New York. It did not force Britain to negotiate. But it did something more urgent. It proved the revolution was still alive. That was enough. Sometimes a small battle becomes large because of when it happens. Trenton happened at the exact moment the American cause needed proof more than it needed territory. If Washington had won the same fight in a season of confidence, it might have been remembered as a useful raid. But in December 1776, after the long retreat, after the fall of New York, after the collapse of morale, after the fear that enlistments would empty the army, Trenton became something else. It became oxygen. The army could breathe again. The Congress could hope again. The states could believe again. The soldiers could look at one another and say that the British and Hessians were not untouchable. They could be surprised. They could be beaten. The war was not over unless Americus. Annes agreed that it was over. That psychological shift mattered more than the map. Look at what Washington actually gained. He gained prisoners. He gained weapons and supplies. He gained time. He gained morale. He gained a story. Do not underestimate that last one. Wars run on logistics, but revolutions also run on stories. People sacrifice when they believe sacrifice has meaning. Soldiers stay when they believe staying could matter. Civilians support a cause when they believe the cause has a future. Politicians take risks when they believe the army has not already failed. Before Trenton, the story of the war was becoming one of collapse. After Trenton, the story changed. Washington crossed the Delaware. Washington surprised the enemy. Washington captured a garrison. Washington had not given up. The army had not disappeared. The revolution had not died. That story moved faster than any army. The timing made the story even more powerful. It came at Christmas, when the enemy expected winter quiet and many Americans were thinking about home. It came after a sequence of defeats so bleak that any victory would have felt larger than itself. It came after Paine's words had framed the moment as a test of souls. It came just before enlistments threatened to strip Washington of the men he needed to continue. The victory gave Washington something practical to ask for. Not blind faith. Not endless suffering. One more chance. Stay because the army can still win. Stay because the enemy is not invincible. Stay because last night changed something. That is a much stronger argument than speeches alone. Men who might have gone home could now look at captured enemy soldiers and know that sacrifice had produced a result they could see with their own eyes. The revolution had become tangible again. That mattered to morale in a way no proclamation could fully replace. And it reached people who needed to hear it. This is why the battle resonates so strongly with American memory. It is not merely a story about a commander making a clever move. It is a story about refusing to accept the obvious ending. In December 1776, the obvious ending was defeat. The stronger enemy had won the campaign. The American army was shrinking. The weather was brutal. The political situation was unstable. The cause exhausted. Washington chose to act anyway. That is the kind of moment Americans like to remember because it fits a deeper national self-image. The underdog. The comeback. The desperate gamble. The belief that a low point is not the same thing as the end. But if the story is told too cleanly, it loses its depth. This was not destiny. Washington could have failed. The boats could have been trapped in the ice. The army could have arrived too late. The Hessians could have been ready. American muskets could have been ruined by the storm. The Outflanked could have become a street fight that bled Washington's army white. British reinforcements could have moved faster. The retreat back across the river could have become chaos. The future United States hung on decisions made in darkness by people who did not know they were becoming symbols. That uncertainty is what makes the story human. We often look backward and make the founding of a country feel inevitable. But nations are not inevitable. They are fragile at birth. They survive because people make choices before. They know whether those choices will be honored or forgotten. The men who crossed with Washington did not know that school children would one day learn about them. They did not know that paintings would turn the crossing into a national icon. They did not know that the Delaware would become sacred geography in American memory. They knew they were cold. They knew they were tired. They knew the river was dangerous. They knew the enemy was across it. They knew the year was almost over. And they knew the army might vanish if nothing changed. That is enough. History does not always feel historic while it is happening. Sometimes it feels like wet clothes, frozen hands, bad roads, fear, confusion, and orders shouted in a storm. Only later does the meaning become clear. Trenton also reveals something important about Washington's leadership. Washington was not a perfect general. He lost battles. He misjudged situations. He struggled with militia, supplies, enlistments, political pressure, and the impossible geography of war in North America. He was not a battlefield magician who always knew exactly what to do. But he had a rare ability to understand the relationship between military action and public belief. He knew that an army could lose its spirit before it lost its last battle. He knew that a rebellion could die from discouragement. He knew that preserving the army mattered, but he also knew that preserving the army only to watch it dissolve from despair would not save the revolution. That is why Trenton was such a dangerous decision. Washington had spent months avoiding destruction. He had retreated because keeping the army alive was essential, but by late December, survival alone was no longer enough. The army needed to show that it could still act. There comes a moment in a crisis when avoiding defeat is no longer sufficient. You have to create belief. That was Trenton. Washington did not suddenly become reckless. He chose a target that was vulnerable. He planned carefully. He used surprise, weather, timing, and enemy complacency. But he also accepted that no plan could remove all risk. That is command. Not perfect certainty. Judgment under pressure. The British and Hessians, meanwhile, suffered from a different problem. They had begun to believe the war was nearly won. That belief was understandable, but dangerous. When a stronger army believes a weaker enemy is broken, it starts to relax in small ways. Winter quarters feel safer. Patrols become routine. Warnings become annoying rather than urgent. Officers assume that what the enemy has not done recently, the enemy can no longer do. Washington attacked that assumption. He did not just attack Trenton. He attacked the idea that the Americans were finished. And that idea collapsed faster than the garrison. The victory at Trenton was followed by more action. This is another reason the battle should be understood as a turning point rather than a single lucky strike. Washington did not win at Trenton and then return permanently to safety. The situation remained dangerous. British forces under Cornwallis moved to confront him. The Americans had to maneuver again, and once again Washington used movement, timing, and enemy expectations to his advantage. At Princeton, only days later, Washington struck another blow. The victory there was smaller than the great battles of later wars. But in the context of January 1777, it mattered enormously together. Trenton and Princeton transformed the mood of the campaign. The British had expected a collapsing rebellion. Instead, they faced a commander who had crossed a river, captured a garrison, slipped away from danger, and struck again. That sequence became the 10 crucial days. The name is not an exaggeration. In 10 days, Washington changed the emotional direction of the war. He did not make victory certain. He made defeat less certain. At that moment, that was enough to keep history open. Washington did not simply take the win and disappear into legend. The days after Trenton were dangerous and complicated. British forces undead. Washington had to maneuver carefully. The campaign continued into what became known as the 10 Crucial Days, ending with another important American success at Princeton. That sequence mattered because Trenton was not an isolated spark. It was the beginning of a turn. A small victory created confidence. Confidence made further action possible. Further action multiplied the effect. By the time the dust settled, the British had lost the feeling that the war was almost neatly finished. Washington had shown that even after disaster, his army could strike. That was the lesson. Not that the Americans were suddenly dominant. They were not. Not that the war would now be easy. It would not. Not that British power had vanished. It absolutely had not. The lesson was that the rebellion still had a pulse. And once a cause still has a pulse, it can be very hard to kill. This is why Trenton should not be remembered merely as a clever holiday raid. It was a battle against collapse. The enemy was Rawls' garrison, yes, but the deeper enemy was despair. Despair was telling soldiers to go home. Despair was telling civilians to accept British pardon. Despair was telling Congress to flee. Pompey's despair was telling the world that the Declaration of Independence had been a dramatic mistake. Washington attacked despair by attacking Trenton. That is the deeper reason the battle matters. The American Revolution survived because it found a way to turn one freezing night into a new story about possibility. And that story still works because people understand the feeling behind it. Everyone knows what it means to be almost finished. Not in a grand historical sense, but personally, a business close to failing, a family under pressure, a dream that looks foolish, a project that has gone wrong, a life moment where retreat has become habit and confidence has disappeared. Trenton resonates because it says the lowest point is not always the final point. Sometimes the lowest point is the moment before the gamble. That is why American audiences respond to this story when it is told properly. It is not only about patriotism, it is about endurance. It is about leadership when the obvious path past surrender. It is about acting when waiting means slow death. But it is also worth remembering the cost and complexity. The Hessians captured at Trenton were human beings too. Many were far from home, serving in a war shaped by kings, contracts, and imperial politics. Some would later choose to remain in America. The American victory was not a cartoon triumph over faceless enemies. It was a hard wartime blow delivered by desperate men against other soldiers caught in the machinery of empire. That makes the story more serious, not less powerful. A mature history does not need the enemy to be stupid in order for the victory to matter. The victory matters because Washington saw a narrow opening and used it. Because his soldiers endured what the plan demanded. Because the timing changed everything. Because a small town in New Jersey became the place where the revolution stopped falling backward. Think about the contrast. In July, America declared independence with words. In December, it had to prove those words could survive winter. The Declaration said that these colonies were free and independent states. The road through New Jersey asked whether anyone could defend that claim. The crossing of the Delaware was the answer. Not a final answer, not a complete answer, but the first answer after despair. Yes, we are still here. Yes, we can still move. Yes, we can still strike. Yes, this army still exists. That message mattered to the British. It mattered to the Americans. It mattered to anyone in the colonies trying to decide whether the rebellion was worth risking their future for. And it mattered to Washington himself. Commanders are not made of stone. Washington carried enormous pressure. He knew that failure might not only ruin him personally, it might doom a cause that had placed impossible trust in him. He had watched men suffer. He had watched plans fail. He had watched the British take what he could not hold. Trenton gave him more than a tactical success. It gave him proof that his army could still answer him. When he asked them for one more effort, they gave it. That relationship between commander and army is easy to overlook, but it is central. A commander can issue orders. Only an army can make those orders real. At Trenton, Washington's army made the impossible real enough to change the war. Now step back and look at the larger pattern of this series. At Bunker Hill, Americans learned that Britain could be made to bleed. With the Culper spy ring, Washington learned that information could keep a weaker army alive. At Trenton, he learned that timing, surprise, and morale could turn a small strike into a strategic shock. This is how America outflanked Britain, not always by moving around the side of a battlefield. Sometimes by attacking the enemy's assumptions. Britain assumed the rebellion was nearly broken. Washington proved it could still strike. Britain assumed winter meant safety. Washington used winter as cover. Britain assumed a beaten army would remain passive. Washington made passivity impossible. Britain assumed victory in New York had decided the campaign. Washington made a small New Jersey town matter more than anyone expected. That is outflanking in the deepest sense. Changing the meaning of the war faster than the enemy can react. The Battle of Trenton did not make America independent, but it helped make independence believable again. And that may be just as important. A cause does not need to be winning every day to survive. It needs enough moments to convince people that tomorrow is still worth fighting for. Trenton was one of those moments. The night before the attack, the revolution looked close to dead. The morning after, it had a story that still survives. A river, a storm, a commander who refused to let the year end in defeat, an army that crossed when it could have quit, a town taken before the enemy was ready, a victory small enough to fit inside a single winter morning, but large enough to keep a nation from disappearing. That is why the story still matters. Not because it proves America was destined to win. It proves the opposite. It proves America was not destined to win. It came close to losing everything. It survived because people acted before survival looked reasonable. That is a harder, better, more honest version of the founding story. The United States was not born from uninterrupted triumph. It was born from retreat, fear, hunger, exhaustion, political uncertainty, military failure. And one freezing night, when a desperate army did something the enemy believed it no longer had the strength to do. That is more powerful than myth, because myth says heroes never truly fall. History says they fall, retreat, bleed, freeze, doubt, and then sometimes cross the river anyway. The crossing was not the end of the revolution's suffering. Hard years still lay ahead. Valley Forge would come, betrayal would come, Southern campaigns would come, mutinies, shortages, political arguments, and battlefield disasters would continue. Yorktown was still far away. But after Trenton, the revolution had survived its darkest December. That matters. Every long struggle has a darkest December. A point where the original confidence is gone, the easy speeches sound hollow, and the cost becomes impossible to ignore. That is when the truth of a cause is tested, not when the crowd is cheering, not when the flags are new, not when victory feels certain. The truth is tested when the road is frozen and the army wants to go home. At that moment, Washington did not have the luxury of certainty. He had a choice: wait and watch the army dissolve, or gamble. He gambled. And because he gambled, America got another chance. That is the real legacy of Trenton. Not that one battle saved everything forever. History is never that simple. But one battle saved the possibility of everything. The possibility that the army could survive. The possibility that enlistments could be extended. The possibility that civilians could regain faith. The possibility that foreign observers might one day see the American cause as more than a doomed rebellion. The possibility that the Declaration would become more than words. Sometimes possibility is enough. Enough to carry men through another month. Enough to persuade a soldier to stay. Enough to make an enemy hesitate. Enough to turn a retreat into a campaign. Enough to keep a revolution alive. This is why Trenton deserves to be remembered not only as Washington's famous crossing, but as one of the great psychological reversals in American history. It changed the question. Before Trenton, the question was whether the rebellion was already over. After Trenton, the question became what Washington might do next. That is a massive change. The British had been watching a retreating army. Now they had to watch a dangerous one. The difference between those two things is not always numbers. Sometimes it is morale. Sometimes it is leadership. Sometimes it is the memory of a night when everyone expected the enemy to stay frozen on the far side of a river, and instead he arrived in the storm. If you were a British or Hessian officer after Trenton, you could still tell yourself that Britain would win the war. The Empire still had enormous advantages. It still held New York. It still had ships, money, trained soldiers, and global reach. But something had changed. Washington was not finished. That fact was now impossible to ignore. And for the Americans, that fact was everything, because they did not need to believe victory was certain. They only needed to believe defeat was not. That is the emotional center of the story. Trenton did not give Americans certainty. It gave them enough uncertainty to keep hope alive. And hope in a revolution can be a weapon. Not a soft weapon. A dangerous one. Hope keeps soldiers in camp. Hope keeps civilians supplying armies. Hope keeps Congress functioning. Hope keeps commanders planning. Hope keeps an enemy from turning a military advantage into political surrender. Washington's Christmas gamble restored hope at the exact moment it was most needed. That is why the night matters. That is why the river matters. That is why Trenton matters. America almost died in December 1776. Not because the idea of independence was weak, but because ideas need people willing to suffer for them after the first excitement fades. The men who crossed the Delaware were not marching through a parade. They were marching through the ugly middle of a failing war. And that is where the true test was. Anyone can cheer a cause at the beginning. The question is who crosses the river when the cause looks lost. That question is why Washington's gamble still speaks to Americans. It also speaks because it complicates patriotism in a useful way. The story is not saying that America was always strong, always united, or always destined to succeed. It says the opposite. It says the country began in weakness, division, doubt, and fear. It says that even the people who declared independence had to earn the right to keep believing in it. That version of the story is more honest, and it may be more inspiring. A perfect origin story can feel distant. A fragile origin story feels human. It tells people that institutions, freedoms, and national ideals do not survive because they are written down once. They survive because at critical moments, someone accepts responsibility for carrying them through danger. For American viewers, Trenton is not just a military episode. It is a reminder that the founding was not a clean monument. It was a crisis survived by imperfect people under almost impossible pressure. That gives the story depth. It lets the audience feel pride without pretending the moment was easy. It is not simply about the founding generation being heroic. It is about the fragility of every great project. It is about the moment when quitting would make sense. It is about leadership that does not deny reality, but refuses to let reality have the last word. Washington saw the disaster clearly. Then he moved anyway. That is the difference between fantasy and courage. Fantasy pretends the danger is not real. Courage sees the danger and crosses the river. So when we remember the crossing of the Delaware, we should not make it too clean. Do not remember only the painting. Remember the cold. Remember the ice. Remember the failed parts of the plan. Remember the men whose enlistments were almost over. Remember the army that had been chased across New Jersey. Remember the Congress fleeing Philadelphia. Remember that independence was not yet a fact of history. It was a claim under threat, a claim that needed defenders. And on Christmas night, those defenders climbed into boats. That is the story. Not a miracle, a gamble, not destiny, a decision. Not an army at its peak, an army at the edge. And that is why the victory mattered so much. Because a strong army winning a battle proves strength. A broken army winning at the edge of collapse proves something else. It proves that the story is not over. By the end of the day, Trenton belonged to Washington's army. But more importantly, the future belonged to possibility again. The British would keep fighting. the Americans would keep suffering. The war would continue for years. But December 1776 would no longer end as a simple story of defeat. It would end with a river crossed, a garrison captured, and a revolution still breathing. That is why this was the night America refused to die. If this story surprised you, hit subscribe, because this channel is about the hidden decisions, impossible gambles, battlefield deceptions, and desperate moments that changed military history. And I want to hear your take in the comments. Was Trenton the most important small battle in American history? Or was there another moment when the revolution came even closer to collapse? Drop your thoughts below and tell me which desperate gamble in history deserves its own episode. Because sometimes a nation is not saved by a massive army or a perfect plan. Sometimes it is saved by one freezing night, one dangerous river, and a commander who refuses to let the story end.